So today we come to the main focus of our course, which is the contemporary contest between two ethics. The ethic that we call self-fashioning and nonconformity, and the ethic of responsibility, of connection and responsibility. And I'm going to proceed in brief steps, giving Michael a chance to comment as I go ahead, and then we'll open up to the class. So both these ethics stand on one side of a contrast of conceptions of happiness, as I observed before. In the contrast between views that see happiness as the absence of pain or suffering, and views that see it as fullness of activity, both of these ethics are decisively on the second side. And both of them, therefore, are willing to brook trouble for the sake of life, of more being, of more affirmation. And therefore, as well, both of these ethics stand on one side of a second division, a division between the ethical views that advise us to stay out of trouble and the views that advise us to seek trouble. They are both instances of the views that advise us to seek trouble, once again for the sake of a higher life, of our ascent to a higher form of being. Now, what is the essential message presented in the most general terms? And I am going to want to couch it in a form that avoids its simple reduction to some form of individualism. The essential message is that we should seek in the course of our lives to come more fully into the possession of life. And to come more fully into the possession of life in the present moment, which is in the end all that we have. We don't live in the future or in the past. We live only now. And what does it mean to come more fully into the possession of life? What are the outward attributes of life, of vitality? So first, surfeit. Life exceeds structure. There is always more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, than there is or ever can be in the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. So it is this quality of excess, which is the first outward attribute of life. The second is the quality of spontaneity, that because there is this excess of life over structure, the future is not controlled by the past. And therefore, as well, there follows a third outward attribute, which is surprise. We are able to cause surprise to others and to ourselves to the extent that we enhance this vitality. Now, furthermore, you could say that the manifestation of our success in the enhancement of life is that we become more human by becoming more godlike. We increase our share in the divine attribute of transcendence, not in the attributes of omnipotence or omniscience. The transcendence of spirit over structure. Indeed, one understanding of the meaning of the term spirit is that spirit is being or existence insofar as it transcends structure. We do not live to become more godlike. It's rather the opposite. We become more godlike in order to live. in order to affirm our humanity, and by becoming more godlike, we become more human. And what is the enemy in this struggle of ours to affirm life against its enemies? What are its enemies? Its enemies are variously described as society, conventional morality, the other, the script. History and society attempt to impose on us a script that negates our vitality. Emerson tells us imitation is suicide. And desire is mimetic. We, in general, desire what others desire. And the refusal of this imitation is one of the first moves in the enhancement of vitality. So there you have an initial account of the central message of this ethic. And before I go any further, let me stop there and ask, Michael, would you like to comment?
Sure. So let me just say a few very quick words to put this in a larger comparative perspective with what we were discussing earlier in the course. So we've already looked at two of these major attempts during this crucial period, again, mid-first millennium BCE, and then over the subsequent millennium, roughly speaking, to radically rethink the world in these, generally we can call them philosophical religious movements, but they really go beyond our narrow definitions of each term. And in 2 weeks, of course, we'll be looking at a third of these. In our discussion of today and next week, we will be exploring this vision of self-reliance, radical self-transformation, which, as Professor Unger has mentioned, is one of the two major ongoing forms going on today. We mention this because, as we've touched on briefly, and here let me lay out more explicitly, this vision is in many ways a secularization and naturalization of elements of Christianity, with powerful versions and, as we have already seen, extremely domesticated versions. What is going on, and this begins really in the 19th century in terms of what we will be looking at, you get an attempt to say, taking a very generally Christian model, but shifting it to say that actually the individual becomes the equivalent of God. The individual becomes the radical creator agent, capable of creating new worlds, and therefore someone who is beyond, I'm choosing my words carefully for reasons that'll become clear in a couple of sentences, goes beyond any existing structure. Now, since we're humans and not gods, what in practice does this mean? We've already discussed very briefly the domesticated version of this, and let me say a few more words about it in contrast to what we'll be discussing today. So that domesticated version that, as Professor Unger has said, has taken the form of sort of the general individualism that's become dominant in places like America, for example, takes the following form. Yes, we are all little gods, but we're little gods in an incredibly restrictive sense. We're little gods because we control our property. That's kind of it. And then we have to come up with mechanisms by which our so-called creative actions don't impinge too much upon the other individuals around us. And in our very first full class, we discussed the variations that are played out throughout liberal ideology in the 19th through the 20th and now 21st centuries of how you will adjudicate these various forms of interaction of these individuals. You take the Kantian approach and say, well, we're all self-legislating individuals, so we don't conform to a pre-existing dogma, we legislate to ourselves. But we can only legislate to ourselves if we legislate in such a way that everything we legislate could be a universal value. And if we do that, of course, it would gain universal assent by definition, and therefore we still recreate a world in which we all properly live according to the law, but all as self-legislating individuals. Or, as we've noted, you take the version of, say, let's search for a consensus form of truth, or let's find a mechanism for working out a utilitarian calculus by which we guide our decision making. All of these are attempts to say we begin with individuals, low-level creator deities, and then we work out the relations among them such that we don't kill each other. That's the domesticated low-level version that has become absolutely standard. And when in America you get all of this ideology that will sound a lot like, as we will get to momentarily, say Emerson, the form it takes, of course, isn't really Emerson. The form it takes is that kind of individualism. So I control my own property. I can wear a purple shirt or a blue shirt or a red shirt, and that's how I'm being creative and individualistic, and that's kind of it. I'm slightly exaggerating, but only slightly. That's the domesticated version. Our goal in asking you to read Emerson and Nietzsche is we are taking you to the undomesticated version of this. The attempts to think in terms of radical self-reliance, radical self-creation, radical self-transformation that would not fall into the kinds of easy individualism within kind of some form of institutional mechanism to create adjudication amongst the individuals that had become standard in liberal political ideology. All of the figures we'll be discussing, including both today, Emerson and Nietzsche, would say that vision that we have been discussing, sort of the liberal political model, is in itself a form of conformity that we should be breaking from. So, what we'll be discussing today, on the contrary, is the undomesticated version, and trying to take it seriously. We will see its power. You kind of can't not. It's an incredibly powerful vision when articulated fully. It's, for that precise reason, it's a bit terrifying, and we will try to openly wrestle with the dangers of this approach and ask philosophically, a little bit today, but even more dramatically next week, how could we rework the undomesticated version into a much more powerful philosophical vision that will not fall into the dangers that we'll be discussing today with an Emerson and a Nietzsche. So with that as a very quick background, let me hand things back over to Professor Unger.
So
yes.
on the question of the relation of this ethic to Christianity,
yes,
of course, a powerful affinity that it has to Christianity is the central emphasis on transcendence and creativity. Yes. On the other hand, the way in which it might be said to be distant from Christianity is that, unlike Christianity, it doesn't begin from the central emphasis on love.
Right.
And the Christian idea that we are all bound together by an invisible circle of love. Yes. And in Christianity, the emphasis on transcendence is inseparable from the emphasis on love. So then we can ask, and this is the second step then of my discussion, how should we understand the philosophical background of this view and place it in the larger world history of philosophy? Now, I think there's a problem there because the philosophers of this view, like Emerson and Nietzsche, give an account of this philosophy which I frankly think is somewhat questionable and weakens the view in its moral and psychological content rather than enhancing it. So I think we need to provide the view with its philosophical presuppositions independently from the presuppositions which those philosophers have given to it. And one place to begin is with the contrast among those three major orientations or options in the world history of philosophy that we previously described. So On the one hand, there is the philosophy of deep structure. Time exists, time is real, but it's not completely real. Because what is most real in the world, the elementary constituents of reality of nature, and the constants, the laws, constants, and symmetries that govern these elementary constituents, is outside of time and is immutable. That's the philosophy of deep structure. That's what we have from Aristotle to 20th century physics. And it persists in the idea, for example, in fundamental physics, that the standard model of particle physics is immutable and somehow always there and governed by laws, constants, and symmetries that are also unchanging. Despite the fact that in the 1920s, we discovered the historical character of the universe, which in turn casts doubt on this claim of immutability. The second major option in the world history of philosophy is the idea of the timeless one that prevailed in ancient India and that was represented as a recessive strand within Western philosophy by philosophers like Schopenhauer, whom we discussed last week. That the distinctions and transformations of the world are either illusory or epiphenomenal, and that ultimate reality is both unified and timeless. Now, it seems to me clear that this ethic that we're discussing does not sit comfortably with either of those views, and that what it does come closest to is what I described as the third option in the world history of philosophy. The option which denies that we should associate reality with timelessness. And it says everything that exists changes sooner or later, but is no less real on that account. There is nothing that is real in the world and that is unchanging. Everything changes. Some things change more quickly than other things. And change itself changes. That is the way in which things are transformed and differ from one another. And that third option, which, as I've said before, speaks with the weakest voice in the world history of philosophy, is the one that we would have most reason to develop as the metaphysical background to this ethic that we are now discussing. And we can unpack it into a series of propositions similar to those propositions that I associated with the philosophical assumptions of Christianity. So first, there is one real world. And the most important thing about the world is that it is what it is, rather than something else. Second, time is real. And time touches everything. There's nothing outside of time. So, what is time then? Time is, in a sense, time is transformation, or the transformation of transformation. A physicist, Richard Feynman, facetiously said, time is what's left when everything else leaves. Third, the new is possible, the radically new. Reality has these possibilities of emergence, of creation, of disruption. And our idea of the possible, rather than being an antecedent prediction or prophecy of what is possible of the new, is in fact something that we see in the rear view mirror. The world changes, and then we form our view of possibility in the light of these changes. Fourth, history is open. History does not have a script, contrary, for example, to classical social theories like Marxism. Fifth, the self, the individual self, has unfathomable depth. And from this depth, their results are obscurity to one another and to ourselves. This obscurity is just the other side of our transcendence. And a sixth proposition is that the ordinary has more potential than the noble. So, with respect to the canonical hierarchies of value, which present certain forms of consciousness as being high and others as being low, it's the low ones that have more potential. Now let me give you an example. Comedy. On this view, we could say comedy is deeper than tragedy, because comedy is about transformation. And transformation is this essential attribute of life. So this is a profound reversal of the canonical hierarchical ideas of the traditional cultures. And I want to suggest, I want to argue, that it is against some such background, some such philosophical background, that we should understand this ethic. Now, let me stop there and again ask Michael whether you want to comment on this.
Absolutely. And let me just pick up on the first theme that you mentioned and then weave that through a couple of your other points. So yes, beginning with the relationship of these movements, again, in their undomesticated form with Christianity, let me underline precisely Professor Unger's point here, that the move here very consistently is to take this notion of the radical creator deity, move it down to the individual level, hopefully avoiding the kind of domesticated version that we have been discussing. But note what is left out, beginning with the point Professor Unger mentioned. Not only is love left out, in the very few first pages of Nietzsche, he will literally state, absolutely clearly, love is precisely part of the problem. That for Nietzsche, going very quickly, he will try to make very much a claim that the radical Übermensch, the great individual that we'll be saying more about later in this class, but that great individual clearly modeled on the great creator deity, but now moved down to the human level. He wants to associate that with the great pagan aristocratic heroic ideal, the great aristocratic warrior who could simply live his life out of his own greatness and his own force of will. And Christianity, with explicitly the claim that no, we should actually develop an ethic of love, Nietzsche will explicitly see as that which holds back the great aristocratic noble ideal that Nietzsche wants to see himself as going back to. So even though he fully takes on the vision of the radical creator individual, based on the radical creator deity of Christianity, it is explicitly in opposition to a notion of love. Emerson is not quite as extreme as Nietzsche in general, but certainly here too you see the exact same theme. I mean, as you've seen in Emerson's Self-Reliance, and when you read more of Emerson, which I highly recommend doing, you will see this theme over and over again. It is all about constant radical originality, endless creativity. Anything that is ever ceasing to be endlessly new and creative is simply becoming conformative. And although he doesn't explicitly attack the notion of love, the implication would be if your sole focus is radically trying to prove to yourself and the world that you're endlessly new and endlessly original and never getting involved in mundane reality, you can imagine where themes like love and connection would come in, or putting it more strongly, they don't. Now, part of the power of this move is the one that Professor Unger has touched on and will be developing later more fully, but it also is going to push against not only the domesticated versions we've been mentioning, but all of the other forms of domestication that we've touched on briefly too. So we've mentioned the kind of secularized vision of an end time. So if you take the Christian notion of a second coming, in the secularized version that play out in the 19th century, that can take, for example, the Marxist vision of a final endpoint in history with the final communist state. More recently, the post-1989 Fukuyama version that somehow the end of history was, surprise, surprise, 1990s liberal America. All of these are based upon a secularization of that notion. Now, in these undomesticated versions, that is rejected too. So you're an explicit rejection of any pre-given script that will tell us what the endpoint will be. Again, that's part of the excitement and part of the power, but returning briefly to that notion of love that's left out of this, by rejecting these scripts very, very successfully, giving them their terrifying power, note also the dangers of that opening move they are making, a theme that we'll be exploring in detail for the rest of the class. So please.
Now I come to my third step, which is to relate this view to its expressions in society and in history. And this is the expression of a different view of ethics, that ethics is not just a set of doctrines, of abstractions, that if an ethical view lives, if it has power, it must have power because it finds expression in a practical form of social life. In history, in the real history of real societies. And in this sense, the sociology of morals, or the history of morals, must be part of ethics. Even though a sociology of morals or a history of morals by themselves have no necessary normative implication, the reverse is not true. The normative view must include a conception of social and historical reality. And from this standpoint, then, I want to begin by returning to a suggestion I made at the very beginning of our course. Each of these two ethics that we will be considering has a special relationship with one of the two great powers in the world today: the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity with the United States, and the ethic of connection and responsibility to China. Now, what I think is that the features of these ethics that they have acquired as a result of this special association with these two societies is typically what makes them weaker philosophically. And that's why I want to describe these features that result from the historical association as the dust of history. And I want to say, to reconstruct both of these ethics so that they have a stronger form, let's shake off the dust of history. But to do that, we have to understand what the historical characteristics are. So let's begin. Let me present a very general, a very abstract view of the association with the United States that this ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity has. And there are different ways in which one might do that. So I'm going to do that by a reading of the message of the American prophets. Now, those whom I consider the American prophets are people like Emerson, Whitman, Lincoln, and one might add to this list on the other side, the side of the shadow, Melville. And what was the message of the American prophets? The message of the American prophets is the individual shares in the divine life. and especially in this divine attribute of transcendence, the ordinary man and woman can ascend to a higher form of life. The political creed of democracy is subservient to this larger idea of our ascent to the divine life. And so this was the essential message. Not that the individual just is loved by God, but in a sense, the individual is God. He is part of the internal life of God. And this message of the American prophets, that the aim in society is not the humanization of the social order, it is the divinization of humanity. This message, in my view, as a critic of the American prophets, from the very outset bore a double taint. So it is not enough to say the message of the American prophets has not been enacted. It is necessary to criticize the message of the prophets. And what is this double taint? So one taint is an inadequate representation of the relation between self-construction and solidarity. Imagining that solidarity, generosity, philanthropy is what we do after we have constructed ourselves. It's the afterthought. It's the consequence of our strength and of our magnanimity. Failing adequately to understand that solidarity is internal to self-construction. And thus, forever, the tendency in the United States has been to understate the extent to which the circumstances of society are alterable, and to exaggerate the extent to which the individual can save himself. So at the end, at the extreme, the individual becomes like a little Napoleon crowning himself. And this is a perversion. This is a false message. It's a taint. Now, the second form of falsehood is then what you could call institutional idolatry. And the form that it has taken in the United States, exaggerating now to make clear my idea, is this belief of the Americans that at the time of the foundation of their republic, they discovered the definitive formula of a free society. Politically, in the Constitution, and economically, in the organization of the market order. And the rest of humanity must either subscribe to this formula or continue to languish in poverty and despotism. So this is a form of idolatry, which should be unacceptable to a Christian, because all the institutional forms that exist in the world are dust in the face of God. All of them are flawed, all of them are mutable, and there is no such formula on which we can fix. So this idea of the message of the American prophets has economic and political implications, and it has religious implications. So among the economic and political implications is the cult of the Constitution associated with the national identity, the idealization and reification of the market order, and the denial of the truth that a market order can take radically different forms, and that there is no single natural and necessary form of the market order. And on the religious side, the implication can be brought out by identifying the distinctive contribution of the American people to the religious history of humanity. So you could say that in the United States there are three main religious tendencies. There are the traditional Christian churches, Catholic and Protestant. There is the secular humanism, which is to a very large extent simply a pietistic secularization of the Christian ideas. And there's the third element, the element which Harold Bloom, for example, called the American religion. These were the religions that the Americans themselves invented, like Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists. And in these religions, the distinctively American ones, the central idea is that the individual is God. He's not just connected to God. It's not just that God loves him. It's that he participates internally in the divine life. And so this then suggests and this is the individual. So this then is the historical background to what I'm calling the dust of history. And it is against this background that we can understand the characteristic forms that the ethic has taken, for example, that it takes in Emerson. Now, there's one more thing to say with respect to this element of the history and sociology of morals. And that is, also repeating an earlier claim I made in our arguments, that each of these ethics is powerful because it's not just a doctrine, an abstraction. Each of them is related to a functional imperative of the advanced societies. The ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity is linked to the imperative of the enhancement of personal agency. These societies require the formation of individual agents who are able to reinvent, to revise the political and economic arrangements within which they work. The individual must be able to stand up, and he must have this creative power, this revisionary power. On the other hand, these societies also depend on the development of higher forms of cooperation. And one of the characteristics of the higher forms of cooperation is that they be hospitable to innovation. That the cooperative regime must not be threatened. It must not be opposed to innovation. It must be organized in such a way as to make innovation possible. Now, I think it's very clear that these two functional imperatives, the enhancement of personal agency and the development of the higher forms of cooperation, depend on each other. They're reciprocally related. But it's also true that they are in tension with each other. And so it is this combination of reciprocal relation and reciprocal tension which is part of the background to the contest of these ethics considered as abstract doctrines. So that's what I want to say, or that's all I want to say for the moment about this element of the sociology of morals, or the history of morals, the dust of history.
Yes, I will be brief since I'm in full agreement. That was argued beautifully. I fully agree. The danger of the way this has been articulated by figures like Emerson, and as Professor Unger has mentioned, we can increase the list, Whitman, Lincoln, etc. This is precisely the danger. On the one hand, the incredible power of that vision, and you clearly see it with Emerson in our reading this week, is that extraordinary vision of the radical individual, endlessly self-creative, endlessly self-transforming, refusing any form of conformity. It's incredibly exciting when you read this. And what this has meant in practice, as this has become the dominant ideology in America, is this radical form of individualism that ironically also results in an absolute inability to even debate forms of transformation, ludicrously ironically. And the reasons, as Professor Unger has mentioned, is precisely that in that vision, the view is we have accomplished this. We in America, with the Constitution, have created a system in which these radically free individuals can so be radically free. The only danger is that we will tend individually to fall back into conformity, which is why we need these inspiring essays by Ian Emerson to keep us going. But that is the danger. And as long as we individually keep refusing to conform to the world around us, it can keep going, meaning that we already have the political and economic system that will allow that to continue. And when, and needless to say, one has for now 2 centuries had very, very, I would say, powerful critiques of economic and political forms that have been dominant in America, very much including today, it is amazing how difficult it is to get any traction in the American political sphere for any kind of significant transformation. The view is, well, if you rethink anything of a market economy, you're infringing on the individual. If you rethink any institutional framework, you're infringing on the individual, as if the current framework in America somehow really gives you the kind of individualism that these theories are calling for. And it would seem from the outside, obviously it doesn't. I mean, obviously it needs to be rethought, and yet it's almost impossible to get any traction along those lines. And the reason, as Professor Unger has argued, is precisely the view that once you make the move into the radical creative individual without bringing in from the beginning any concern of relations, what the Christians would call love, any concerns about the degree to which self-transformation is inherently based in our relations with each other. If you don't build that in and simply say, after we get the radical creative individual, then we'll worry about how not to infringe on each other's rights, it means by definition, you cut out any of what ought to be the really significant work for rethinking the political and economic world. And ironically, and this is what we'll be turning to momentarily, you cut out actually what we could be doing even in the world of self-transformation, because you pre-create a script of what transformation means, which is this endless transgression against the world around you, which becomes a straitjacket in itself, where you're endlessly trying to show, look at how radically individual I am, because I'm not doing what everyone else is doing, which in itself becomes an endless straitjacket. Why should our concern be to endlessly be different from everyone else? I mean, why is that less of a herd mentality than doing the same as everyone else? They're equally straitjackets. So ironically, the form it's taken in America has resulted in an absolute refusal to take seriously political, economic, social transformation, and ironically, even a straitjacketing of the vision of what self-transformation really could and possibly should entail.
Okay, so now we come to the 5th step of my argument, and that is to say that this view that we're talking about, self-fashioning and nonconformity, has spoken in different voices. And in particular, there are 3 voices I think we should distinguish. So the first is the voice of the philosophers, like Emerson and Nietzsche. The second is the voice of liberal political theory. And the third is the voice of romanticism. And I want to say a word about each of them. So first, the philosophers. The philosophers present this metaphysical construction to a greater or lesser extent. These particular philosophers, Emerson and Nietzsche, that we're reading today, veer between metaphysics and allegory. And it's not clear how literally they want us to take their metaphysical presuppositions. So let's take Nietzsche, for example. So it's very interesting as a moral psychologist. And the focus is on the forces that negate life, what Nietzsche calls the reactive forces. And and how we are to defeat them in order to affirm life. And there is a trajectory which is implied in Nietzsche's account of this. So in which we live through our servitude to these reactive forces that deny life, and then we eventually create the conditions to overthrow the rule of the reactive forces. And there's stages. So the first stage is ressentiment, resentment. Resentment at the superior forces that are denying life. And the theme there is, it's your fault, of the ones who are binding my possibilities. Then there's the second stage, bad conscience. It's my fault. So I become the seat of these reactive forces that deny life. Then there's a third stage, the ascetic ideal, sublimation. So the service to the reactive forces is sublimated into a moral ideal. Then there's the fourth stage, the death of God. The death of God is not an idea or a doctrine for Nietzsche, it's an event. So it's God was the seat of this denial of life, and then we kill God, but killing God is not the solution, because then something else comes. History, utility, whatever, social welfare, continuing as these reactive forces. And we keep going after the death of God until we get to what Nietzsche calls the last man, and the man who wants to die, who has emptied the callus of all of this ressentiment, denial of life, and is finally ready for a reversal. So I think that these philosophers are most usefully read as the psychologists of this view in a particular perspective, rather than as the metaphysicians that they occasionally pretended to be. So let's say that's one voice of this view. The second voice is liberal political philosophy, with based on two propositions. So first, an idea of the self-determination, the autonomy of the individual. And it's an idea which was framed too narrowly, too dogmatically, on an aristocratic view of self-possession. Like the Lord who could live in his dominion and who could be the boss and who didn't depend on anything. That's the core of the idea. And then an institutional project which suffers from the defect of its dogmatism. It says, this is the solution. Establish the system of liberal rights and you will be both free and rich. Now, a central flaw in this liberal political philosophy is the way in which it contrasts the right and the good. So the fundamental aim of the liberal political theory is to create the basis for an impersonal, neutral order of right. Neutral with respect to conflicting visions of the human good. And what is the problem? The problem is that no institutional order can be neutral in this way. Every institutional order tilts the scales in favor of some forms of experience and against others. And the ideal of neutrality turns out to be in the service of its opposite, because the claim of neutrality for a certain order is a way of immunizing it against attack and criticism. And then it becomes the opposite. That is, its defects are no longer visible or susceptible to attack. It becomes entrenched. Nevertheless, the false idea of neutrality has a kinship to a legitimate and even indispensable idea, which is that the form of social life should be open to a wide range of contradictory experience. And above all, it should be corrigible. It should be susceptible to criticism and transformation. Contradiction and corrigibility are the legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate idea of neutrality. And once we take this into account, then we have a different kind of political theory in which there are no, we recognize the primacy of structural alternatives, but we refuse to succumb to a structural dogmatism. And we begin to develop a larger, more complicated, and more contradictory idea of our ascent to a higher form of being, of our greatness. The third voice in which this ethic spoke is the voice of Romanticism. And what then is the central idea of Romanticism? The central idea has to do with the opposition between spirit and structure. So the Romantic belief is that structure, meaning routine, institutions, repetition, is the hand of Midas that kills the spirit. So what does the Romantic do? The Romantic shakes the structures so that in the interlude in which they are shaken, he can live more fully. The moment of authenticity, of true life, is the moment in which the rule of the structures is temporarily suspended. The crowd in the streets, as opposed to bureaucratic routine, romantic love, as opposed to the routines of married life, and so forth. What's the problem? The problem is the despair and the illusion that is implied in the Romantic belief that the relation between spirit and structure cannot be changed. That structure will always be opposed to spirit. In fact, it could be part of our moral and political project to create structures that are more hospitable to spirit. For example, because they allow us to keep changing them while we are in them, so that we can engage without surrendering. So a fuller account of this ethic would have to take into account these three voices, and not just the voice of the philosophers. And then we would have this more complicated view of the genealogy of the history of this conception of autonomy. Now again, let me stop there and ask Michael, do you want to make a comment?
Absolutely, and just building on that tripart division, so liberal political ideology on the one hand, the philosophers on the other, and Romanticism going the other way. Yes, I think each of these has an incredible power in working out this notion of self-transformation. The danger is precisely, as Professor Unger has mentioned, all of their weaknesses at times seen by the others aren't being worked out in any way that can actually lead to the development of the movement. And just to lay this out very explicitly, beginning with the middle one. So, as we've seen in liberal political ideology, the idea is, well, we'll define every individual as an individual, a divine being, but only minorly so, in the sense that we control our own property. We'll find means of adjudicating the relationships between them, and we discussed in our first class the possible means of doing so. So the debates are, do we tax X amount and give it and have X amount of Y amount of welfare, or tax less and have less welfare, but always within a very restricted frame, not allowing the kind of radical rethinking of the world that one would think would be coming directly out of these sets of issues. Then, in terms of the two criticisms, we see yet more dangers, as Professor Unger has mentioned. So in the philosophers, our readings for this week, we hardly, I suspect, for any of us, find the moves that would be worked out by implication politically very rewarding. Let me just be as explicit as I can. So let's take Nietzsche as a typically extreme example. So Nietzsche, of course, will explicitly see liberal political ideology as nothing but a secularization of Christian ethics. It is equally simply a product of resentment, holding back the great noble individual that he wants himself to be, and that he's calling on the few figures who can return to the great aristocratic noble warrior ideal. So liberal political ideology for him is nothing but yet a continuation of that same resentment politics. Now, what would this mean by implication politically were we to follow Nietzsche? Nietzsche never lays it out, but certainly figures have used Nietzsche. I don't mean to imply that these utilizations were based upon an accurate, careful philosophical reading of Nietzsche. However, I still think they are telling. The most significant utilization of Nietzsche, of course, occurs by Nazis in Germany. And no, Hitler was certainly not carefully reading Nietzsche. In fact, we even have some of his notebooks, and he's sort of underlining the lines of, the radical triumph of the will and happily ignoring other sentences. However, it's not easy to imagine a different mode of reading Nietzsche that would lead to something radically different than what the Nazis were trying to do, right? I mean, if you followed out the implications of Nietzsche, what you would get is indeed a rejection of the liberal political order. And how would that be done? It would be done by some figure, the Übermensch, who would be granting a new set of values to the world. Yes, those following it would be continuing a herd mentality, but for Nietzsche, that's by definition going to be the case. He doesn't think all of us are going to become these Übermensch. So the new one who will come and be the transvaluator of all values, he thinks that that is clearly himself philosophically, and a future political figure would do the same thing politically, and that figure would create a new reality. Hitler is not being utterly, completely wrong to see the beginnings of his vision in a figure like Nietzsche. Again, I don't mean to imply Nietzsche leads directly to Nazism, but I do mean to imply it is difficult to imagine a political working of Nietzsche's ideology that would involve anything other than one figure, the radical Übermensch, creating a new reality that everyone else is expected to follow. And obviously, there would be no possible critique of the tremendous implications of that order in terms of a destruction of anything that stood in the way of the values. So yes, a very sophisticated, at some level, critique of political liberal ideology and its reduction of the human, but hardly in a way that I think we would find tempting. On the other end of the spectrum, Romanticism, playing out in the vision of the radical individual who would see the typical liberal order as simply a world of conformists, and the radical romantic, of course, will endlessly break from that, meaning in practice, it's the single individual endlessly playing out the game of trying to be radical and non-conforming, a project that is not only doomed in any long sense, because you can only be radical and transgressive for limited periods of time, but is also totally dependent on the liberal political order that it can claim to be radically breaking from. You need to claim everyone else as a radical conformist in order for me to be the radical figure breaking from it. And so how this plays out in practice, Think of Lord Byron as a typical example. So you get Lord Byron, the radical transgressive figure, radically transgressing British aristocratic society. He's famously described as mad, bad, and dangerous to know because of all of the horrible things he does. He, of course, typically dies tragically young, which a lot of the tragic heroes have to do, because if they don't die young, then the problem is they kind of cease to be so radically transgressive, or they have to kind of act like they're radically transgressive for the rest of the world. An example we all know well is the more recent American version, sort of the prototypical rock star from the late 60s through the 1980s, where, again, it's the radical transgressive rock star, and you can be radically and transgressive for a brief amount of time, but then the problem is either you do OD at age 26, which is when a lot would die, or you don't, but then over time you become you become like the Rolling Stones and Nostalgia Act. You hide away in your house and hope no one remembers what you've done, so no one sees you in terms of what you've become over time. Or you continue to sort of play out the transgression and you become kind of just a self-parody, and sadly there are many of those too. Meaning that in either of these, the radical philosophical view or the radical romantic view, you really do not get any kind of a critique of the liberal political order that you can build upon. The philosophical view are philosophers who, thank God, do not have political power, and rarely when they have been read by political forces, the implications have been horrific. The romantic view is, again, a powerful, limited vision for an artist or a musician or more recently a rock star. But again, it's not only that they're not trying to alter the liberal political order, it by definition means they have to assume a liberal political order of radical conformists to endlessly be transgressing against. So, adding all of this up, I think the question for us is the following. If there's something to this critique, and yet if we think there's at least potentially something incredibly powerful about a vision of radical self-transformation, how would we, I won't even say bring the three together, but rather how would we build upon a vision of self-transformation that would avoid that kind of structure that has now been playing out for over 2 centuries? Liberal political order is the dominant order. It's radical rejection in potentially very, very dangerous ways. It's radical rejection on the romantic side in perhaps less dangerous ways, but nonetheless one that really doesn't enforce any kind of a change. And what would that entail? Now, in 2 weeks, let me say, we will see an attempt to rethink all of this by saying, what if we build a vision of transformation in which everything is about relationships from the very beginning? We will see Confucianism will articulate that and discuss what it would mean to give it its most powerful philosophical formulation. But what we'll be doing here, the rest of today and next week, is with the theme of self-transformation, what could we do? Or putting it more strongly, what if you were to take these visions of Christianity we were discussing before, but in a sense build love into the vision of what self-transformation would entail, so that you were trying to say, for true self-transformation, sorry, for true, Roger may be coming back, sorry, he'll be back in momentarily, I think that's the sound. For true self-transformation to occur, what if we from the beginning built in a vision of love as being an inherent part of that none of us could transform ourselves without seeing ourselves in relationship to each other. Therefore, you would get both a vision of what self-transformation would mean, but also inherent in that act would mean taking seriously what it would mean to transform the world around us as well. In other words, building upon the vision of the radical individual, but equally building upon the notion of love, seeing those as related, and then working out the implications in a way that would avoid the kind of domestication in liberal political ideology, the dangers of the radical Nietzschean, to stick with that example, rejection, or the very limited critique of the endless and ultimately, therefore, non-changing romantic revolution. that will be the goal for the rest of today and even more explicitly next week when we try to rethink what this vision of self-transformation would mean in practice were we to give it a much more powerful foundation than the way it's been developed in these past 2.5 centuries.
So now the sixth step of my exposition, which is to anticipate our discussion of next week about the defects in this view. What are its weak points? Because these weak points then suggest its reconstruction, its revision, so we can formulate a stronger version of it. So I want to bring this critique under 4 main headings. So the first heading is an inadequate view of what is implied in the effort to come more fully into the possession of life. And in particular, the contradictory character of the requirements for coming into the fuller possession of life in the present moment. And so I return to an earlier formulation that I made in the course to you. So we could say, first, in our relation to others, we need to connect to them, but we need to prevent the connection from becoming the basis of subjugation or loss of personal distinction. So how can we connect without being subjugated? There's a tension. And this tension opens up a horizon of political creation, because part of this effort will be the reformation of society in a particular direction. So that it creates the bases for a form of connection that doesn't impose subjugation. But politics takes place in historical time, so if it fails, then we have to make up for its failures in the way we live. Then the second dimension is the relation of the self to the social world. We have to find a way of engaging in the social world without surrendering to it. If we're marginalized, we don't come into the possession of life, if we don't participate. But if the price of our participation is to give the last word to the social and cultural world, rather than to keep the last word for ourselves, we also fail. And so we have to be both insiders and outsiders. We have to find a secular counterpart to Christ's command to be in the world without being of it. Otherwise, we're not free, and we don't come into the possession of life. And the third dimension of these contradictions has to do with our relation to ourselves. So we form a coherent way of being, but this coherent way of being eventually can rigidify, it can become a mask, a shell, a carapace, a mummy. It can take us over and suck the life out of us. And that's what we can't allow to happen. So we have to have a coherent way of being, and at the same time to be able to continue disrupting it from within. So the idea of coming more fully into the possession of life is in fact thoroughly riven by contradictory requirements. And to say that they're contradictory doesn't mean that we can't progress in dealing with them. We can, as I just suggested. But we have to have an adequate account of what they are. Now, the second heading under which I bring these criticisms is the lack of a political horizon in the conventional forms of the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. So for the philosophers, Emerson and Nietzsche, by default, as Michael was just suggesting, what ends up prevailing is this idea that the ultimate agent, the embodiment of this enhanced life is the exceptional individual. Everyone else is the herd, the conformist. And then there's this dialectic between the exceptional and the conformist. So it's the abandonment of humanity. In Romanticism, the despair about structure and about our possibility of changing the relation between spirit and structure. And in liberal political theory, the institutional dogmatism and the false idea of neutrality, which I described before. So none of the voices in which this ethic has historically spoken offer us an acceptable political project. And we have to ask why. Now, the third heading of these defects is that is what you could describe as Prometheanism. So the conventional forms of the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity are all tainted by a Promethean perversion. So what do I mean by Prometheanism? By Prometheanism, I mean the idea that the individual can save himself. And the use of the term Prometheanism may be inappropriate, because you will remember that the real Prometheus stole fire to give it to humanity, whereas these Prometheans steal fire to give it to themselves. So this is not, this is an abuse of Greek mythology. But this Prometheanism is then a denial of our finitude. That's its essential attribute. So we are mortal, we are groundless, and we are insatiable. So the Prometheanism then is a kind of beating of the drums in the presence of death, as if by this celebration of life, of vitality, and of power, we could drown out and deny our fragility. That's the first aspect. It's a form of self-deception that results in a spiritual and moral perversion. The other side of the defect is that through this denial, we lose the most powerful provocation to our awakening from our slumber. That is exactly the aim of this ethic. The aim of this ethic is to awaken us from our submission to routine, to the formulas. And what is the most powerful antidote to this? It's confrontation with our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. It's the recognition of our fragility and of our finitude. And that is precisely what it is the tendency of this ethic in its conventional forms to deny. That's the critique of Prometheanism. Now, the fourth heading, and I think the most fundamental in the critique of this view, is its ultimate emptiness, the emptiness of the idea of autonomy. And in an earlier class, I cited King Lear. I'll cite it again. I shall do such things, what they are, I know not yet, but they shall be the terrors of the earth. So there's this idea that we will have this power of self-determination, but for what? What will we do with it? So, you know, there are many countries in the world in which the progressives, the left, when they don't know what to do, propose a constitutional convention. And then, if you ask them, what will you say in this convention, they don't know. They don't have any idea. So, I'm thinking of this by analogy to this problem, because this is like the constitutional convention of the self. The self will assemble and reorient itself, but it doesn't know what it wants. So the ideal of autonomy presented in this way is bereft of substance. Now, then we can ask, where does it get its substance from? What gives substance to an ideal of autonomy, of self-determination? And let's present the ideal of self-determination in its most radical, unforgiving form. So it's that we're going to do something which won't be determined, it won't be fully shaped by either our genetic or our social background. And to carry it even further, it also won't be shaped by the routinized, rigidified version of the self, the character. The Greeks said the character is destiny. We'll have some freedom from that. And then we'll ask, where then, if the content doesn't come from our genetic and social background, and if it doesn't come from our character, where does it come from? And the answer is, it comes from our connections and our engagements. That's where the content of the ideal of autonomy comes from. Our connections with other people and the tasks we assume in the world. Now, every connection with other people makes us vulnerable. The price of connection is vulnerability. And every engagement, every task makes us vulnerable in a different way. Because in order to assume tasks, we have to take sides. And when we take sides, we can make a mistake. We can take the wrong side. So that's the problem. We're vulnerable then to error, to deception, to self-deception in our engagements in the world. And how then do we choose these connections and these engagements? We have experiences. We could call them epiphanies. They are discoveries of the transformative possibilities of experience. And on the basis of these epiphanies, we also make prophecies, which are anticipations of a larger life. So I think that's where the content of the ideal of autonomy comes from. It comes from our connections and engagements, informed by these epiphanies, which are in turn the basis of our prophecies. And that's what gives content to the ideal of autonomy. But then we need a version of this ethic that does justice to that moral reality. And these inherited conventional versions don't do justice to it. And they are smothered by this, what I call the dust of history. Well, I have one more step, but let me stop there before the last step.
I'll be very brief, and just to underline the fourth point that you were raising, yes, note that all three of these models we were discussing, the liberal political theology in the middle, the philosophical critique, and the romantic critique, all share this basic vision of what autonomy is. They all share the basic vision that think of autonomy as the radical creative individual, always defined as not related to anyone else. Even the liberal political version, of course, admits relations, but only in the sense of they're always an impingement on my individual rights, and so it's all about how do we adjudicate our individual rights. The implication of the model being, of course, that my individuality and what I control, my property in standard liberalism, is mine, and then how do we live so that I don't kill other people? And so what are the minimal levels of impingement I will allow? And of course, in the philosophical version, Nietzsche again being typically the most extreme version, anything that in any manner, shape, or form restricts the Übermensch by definition is a failure of his status as that Übermensch. Less extremely would be the Emerson view, but still there too. It's the vision that I, at my most creative, am always, always non-conforming. And switching to the romantic vision, again, for all of its differences, this still absolute commitment to this notion that me at my most authentic is me radically non-conforming to the world around me. All three, for all the very significant differences amongst them, share that vision of autonomy. The key for autonomy is my individuality in rejection of everything around me, and then, at least in the middle, what minimal things do I have to accept to live in this world? So the question then is, what would it mean, on the contrary, to redefine our notion of autonomy, such that the whole theory of self-transformation, the whole vision of self-transformation, would be based in a practice that is all about connection that by definition would be breaking down the kind of autonomy that undergirds all three of the models we were just discussing, and yet with the acceptance that only by accepting that does one engage in real self-transformation, and by implication, only that kind of self-transformation, only in order to attain that kind of self-transformation does one, by definition, have to think about the entire transformation of the world around one. What would it mean to do that? A way that, again, has really not been developed in any of the variations of these visions of autonomy that have become so dominant in the West in these past 2 centuries.
Okay, now the last thing I want to say is this. Let's imagine a revised version of this ethic that deals with these 4 sets of defects that I just described. What would remain? And I think something very powerful would still remain that would distinguish it, and distinguish it from the revised version of the ethic of connection and responsibility. And I'm simply going to enumerate what would be some of these remaining distinctions, even after the work of revision and correction had been done. So the first is the point of departure. The point of departure is the individual self. Connected, he has to connect and have tasks. But at the end, the individual embodied in a dying organism, the individual on the way to death, radically finite, although capable of transcendence, is the point of departure of this ethic, and will always be in any revised version of it. And it's not obvious that this should be the point of departure of a moral vision. The other ethic that we're going to deal with has a different point of departure. It says the point of departure is not me. It's not the ego. It's not the I, isolated, embodied, and dying. The point of departure is you and me. It's the interpersonal. It's the logic of joint intentionality or interpersonal encounter. That's not a construction. That's the point of departure. So there's this first question of what is the point of departure of our moral thinking? Now, the second element that remains is the idea of the transcendence of the self. We are finite, but we are transcendent. There is always more in us than there is or ever can be in these social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. And this idea that the essential moral logic of human existence is the dialectic of finitude and transcendence remains in every version of this ethic, no matter how much we reconstruct it. Now, a third element that remains is of a completely different character. It's the relation to a historical phenomenon. Remember early in the course I said, by way of helping to explain my own position in these arguments, for the last several centuries, humanity has been on fire. There's been a revolution, a revolutionary transformation. And this revolutionary project has two sides. Has the political side, promising to lift society from every scheme of entrenched social division and hierarchy. And this political side is carried by the doctrines of democracy, liberalism, and socialism. And it has a personalist side, which is carried by the world religions and by Romanticism. And especially the worldwide popular romantic culture, the soap operas, the popular music, it carries throughout the world the message that the ordinary human man and woman is divine and can ascend to a higher form of life. The problem that I identified early in the course is that this project, this revolutionary project, is simultaneously strong and weak. It remains the strongest project in the world in the sense that it continues to command the agenda of humanity. Has many enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. However, in another sense, it's weak. It's weak because its votaries, its champions, its paladins no longer know what its next steps should be on either the political side or the personalist side. And if you don't know what the next steps of a project should be, the project begins to die. It has to be reinvented. We have to breathe new life and new meaning into it to bring it back to life. So that's the sense in which this project is weak. And that explains then the agenda in this course, from my standpoint, which is to help bring new life to this project on the personalist rather than the political side. Now, why do I say this? To explain what the residual character of this ethic is. It's because you can't understand this ethic separately from the history of this project. The history of this ethic is the history of this project. They're inseparable. So the history of this moral vision is entangled with the history of this revolutionary program, for better and for worse. They're not separate. And that's a unique feature of this ethic. So the other ethic that we're going to examine is not necessarily against this program. It can be selective. It can say this is good about it, that's bad about it. But what you can say about it is that its history is part of the history of this program, which is the case here. Now, there's a fourth remaining element after all of the revision and reconstruction. And the fourth element can be described in the sphere of moral psychology rather than of ethics proper. And it says that in all versions of this view, unrevised or reconstructed, there will be the idea of the spiritual privilege of disruption. So the idea is that the disruptors are the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. The Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno gave an expression to this idea when he wrote the following. He said, in the world, the victorious are those who adapt to the world. The defeated are those who demand that the world adapt to them. And therefore, Unamuno added, the progress of humanity rests squarely on the shoulders of the defeated. And he then added, against Nietzsche, Christianity is not the religion of the resentful. Christianity is the religion of the defeated. So this is a profound idea in this ethic. The troublemakers, the disruptors, they're the spiritual vanguard of the human race. And on them, everything depends. And we should cultivate the spirit of disruption in ourselves. That's what will remain. After all of the work of revision is done, these features will still be there. Okay, I finish now.
And beautifully put. Let's open it up for discussion. Please, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, point out some considerations that I think complicate the vision of Nietzsche that's been painted today. Specifically, I don't think he was trying to get rid of Christianity or liberal democracy. I think he very clearly just wanted our human creators to be pulled out of Christianity and liberal democracy so that they could create. He doesn't actually lay out a political philosophy, but it's clear that I think that's kind of his line with maybe the Nazi thread. The other thing is the Uber mentions like very obscure, the meaning of Uber. And so it's not clear to me that he's advocating some Zarathustra-like or Jesus-like figure to come and redeem mankind. And then the third is that I think connection is very possible in Nietzsche's philosophy, specifically companions, our human creator companions. I mean, in Zarathustra he says, companions the creator wants, not disciples. And so I think it complicates the dichotomy of the course, because you can imagine Nietzsche as being the bridge between the two different schools or ways of thinking about the world that we've discussed and that we will discuss, and I think he is the bridge. And so, yeah, I just want to point that out and see what both of you thought about that.
Please. Oh, sure, absolutely. So, yeah, thank you. Very fascinating. Not in the slightest. Very fascinating. And yes, I think part of what is now important to do is exactly what you're suggesting with Nietzsche, and I would generalize the point. Each of the thinkers we're talking about has always been read according to specific visions that have, in the long run, become completely dominant. In the case of Nietzsche, there's of course the horrible reading, the Nazi reading, but also just the readings that have become dominant throughout the 20th century, the non-Nazi readings, that really focus exclusively on, as you said, the kind of Zarathustra radical pieces of Nietzsche. And in fact, as you said, he's a much more complicated thinker. So I agree. I think what we now need to do with Nietzsche, and again, I would generalize it, let's go back through these figures, and indeed, I would say the entire world of global philosophy and religion, and ask what are the elements that we have not been challenged by, that we have not built upon, that we have not thought through, and could we open up possibilities that we have been systematically missing? So, yeah, both a wonderful point, and again, I think a great vision for what we'll be trying to do over these next few weeks. Great, please. Oh, I have no idea which is first, so yeah, please, yeah, please. It's plenty of time for all. Yes, please.
Are you asking Michael? Yes.
Either, up to you.
Go on.
Sure, okay. Yes, so what we're referring to is that as powerful as the Nietzschean critique is, he isn't really giving you an alternative that isn't dependent upon that herd mentality that gives his critique the power. Now, the counter-argument that was brought up, which is worth taking very seriously, is are there elements there that we can build upon to develop that much more sophisticated critique? But the concern is indeed the one you've mentioned. It's that if you take as the liberal political model that middle point, the endless critiques in a sense kind of require that to endlessly be responding to. And what would it mean to actually build a world where that would not simply be you're assuming one world to endlessly critique, but you're actually actively engaged in transforming that world such that disruption becomes a part of our standard mode of existence, even in mundane reality. Yes, please. Right.
So,
Yes.
so I want to state the idea in a stronger way, in a more intransigent way. So, and by relating this problem to the question of how we should think of the difference between progressives and conservatives today. So, the dominant idea of what it means to be a progressive today is the progressive is someone who accords priority to equality against the background of the established institutional arrangements. And this particular combination of an egalitarian profession of faith with an institutional conservatism or skepticism is the background, for example, to the dominant theories of distributive justice in the Anglo-American world, like the Rawlsian theory of justice. They're supposedly egalitarian, but what they really do is they establish a kind of pseudo-philosophical prop to the practices of compensatory corrective redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. Now, I don't think that's what it means to be a progressive. So my view of what it means to be a progressive, which is, I think, much closer to the 19th century view, shared by liberals and socialists, by John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx, is that two things distinguish the progressive from the conservative. The first is the acceptance of the established institutional framework as the unsurpassable horizon of our political projects. Do we think that we can transform the institutional form of the market order? Do we think that we can transform the institutional form of democratic politics? That's what's fundamental. That is, whether there is structural ambition or not, as opposed to just humanizing the established structure. The second distinction, and this also goes to the question of Nietzsche and distinction, is do we believe that it is natural for human life to be small? And in particular, do we think that when we ascend to a higher form of life, we ascend together? We become greater together or not at all? There's no way in which some of us can become great while the others are pushed down. And greatness is indivisible. And that's the other distinction of the progressive. So the progressive is not an egalitarian in the sense that he gives absolute value to greater equality of outcome or of circumstance. What matters is our ascent together to a higher form of life, with greater intensity, with more capability, with more scope. If it's not together, it's not for real. That's what I would say. And so it's the association of the structural ambition with this determination to ascend together, the ordinary man, the ordinary woman. That's what defines the agenda. And so if the whole discourse is a discourse about vitality, enhancement, empowerment, and the protagonist is this individual and his friends, that's not what I count as an instance of this progressive project.
This question is for Professor Unger. How would you fit the moral culture of Latin America into this? Because in Latin America there is a strong emphasis in the individual, but also at the same time a strong emphasis in community and family ties.
Well, I can't generalize in that way. For example, in my country now, we have 50 million evangelical Protestants. So they have a different view than that's a different form. So I would say taking traditional Brazilian society, and this would be applicable to much of Latin America, the characteristic formula of social life has been the combination in the same social relations of three elements: exchange, power, and sentiment. So there is a sentimentalization of unequal exchange in the relation between men and women, between parents and children, between employers and employees, between patrons and clients, and so forth. That's the characteristic formula. Now come the evangelicals, and what they propose is a secession from this world dominated by the secession, by the sentimentalization of unequal relations, into a kind of liberalism for the masses. So there will be micro worlds characterized by a commitment to responsibility, promise-keeping, respectability, and so forth, at a distance. So they're going to be like Schopenhauer's porcupines in the night, settling into this middle distance. And so, of course, I'm opposed to both of these things. And so I'd say there's a contest of moral cultures. And these debates that we're having here in the form of philosophical doctrines speak to these issues. And that's the only, to my view, that's the only acceptable way in which to deal with these ethical propositions. They're not just the messages that metaphysicians put into bottles and throw into the ocean. They're about the actual organization of society.
Yes, please.
Would you be critical of, say, the civil rights era, which aimed to extend liberal rights to Black Americans who didn't have them, but yet upheld the liberal political order and didn't dismantle it, given that you have criticisms of the institutional project of liberal political philosophers who fixed it?
No, I'm not against this fragmentary progress, but we have to discuss the details. So I am opposed to the American way of approaching the relation between race and class and treating race as a threshold issue that has to be dealt with apart from class. So I think it results in a series of, this isn't really intrinsic to the discussion here in this course, but it's an example of, so affirmative action. So affirmative action as a direction, first, it generates benefits in inverse proportion to the need for them. Its greatest contribution is the establishment of a black professional and business class. It does less for the black workers, like policemen and firemen, especially public employees, and least of all for the racially stigmatized black underclass, which fills the American prisons and the secondary part of the labor market. So it's no good if it creates this inverse relation between need and benefit. Second, it separates the black elite from the rank and file and conciliates them, assimilates them to the established order. And third, it offends the white working class majority of the United States, which with some justification believes itself to be the victim of a conspiracy between the white elites and the virtual leadership of the blacks. So I'm opposed to this. I think I'm not an American, so I can't do anything about it, but I think the Americans make a great mistake in separating race and class in this way. And what I would say is they should separate the issue of individualized racial discrimination from the question of collective promotion. Individualized racial discrimination should be sanctioned. It should be criminalized, as it is in many countries. But the advancement of groups that are trapped in a circumstance of subjugation from which they are unable to escape should depend on actual disadvantage. And that then depends on combining class and race and looking to the class position. So there should be collective projects of promotion oriented to the structural realities. And that should be separated from the question of individualized racial discrimination. That's the kind of discussion. So I do think that in general there's a loose relation between this way that we're rehearsing of approaching morals and this structural approach to the problems of society.
I'd love your take on the Russia-Ukraine crisis using today's undomesticated view as a lens through which to analyze it. In particular, Putin. In what way is he playing this narrative of radical self-reliance out, and in what way is he not? And also the secondary point, does Russian philosophy have any parallels with Nietzsche, or is this, are there any kind of the parallels you could draw with Russian philosophy that this war might be based upon?
I think this is way outside of our scope, but I think we might ask our teaching assistant here, Sasha, to speak to this. Do you want to say something, Sasha?
I think that the orienting force for me, or for someone like Putin, has been Carl Schmitt and his vision of the political, which, just to recapture here, is that at the core of the political as such, there is life and death struggle, and our escape from the bleak world where you have friends and you have enemies and battle all the time is really unavoidable. And so, on that view, the United States and its allies just happen to be better equipped, had a little bit more luck from the historical perspective, but now are racketeering the entire world, playing or hiding behind an elaborate facade of the discursive power of multiple texts produced by this university and many others. And I think Putin deeply believes that for our world to have something that is not going to be a monopoly on power, but a world where there are several axes of power, he must be heard. And he must have some possibility for the political project that he thinks he has been running. And so I think he thinks that he is fully justified doing what he is doing at this very second in Ukraine. Because I think he just sees that as stepping up and delivering the kind of political, real and harsh political answer that no one else in the world feels capable of in the 21st century. So there is also the historical mission in that, but I do not want to elaborate on Putin's metaphysics and his philosophy of history because I don't agree with any one of these positions, right? And honestly, I'm beginning to think more and more that he may just be mad.
Thank you. Oh, please, yes.
I know, I think we're finished.
Indeed. So thank you, as always, for a wonderful discussion. Next week, we will continue our discussion of how we would rethink this vision of self-transformation. And then in 2 weeks, we will turn to a very different attempt to build out a vision of transformation based upon relations, and we're focusing on Confucianism as the example. Thank you so much, and see you next week. Thank you.